You filed a complaint about a coworker and watched it disappear into HR without consequence. You sat in meetings where everyone knows someone isn't doing their job, and management acts like the problem doesn't exist.
You've watched someone make the same mistake repeatedly while you got reprimanded for a single error. You've seen layoffs eliminate competent people while the person everyone complains about somehow survives every restructuring.
And the part that made you feel insane was that no one ever explained why. You assumed you were missing something, that maybe your judgment was wrong, that maybe there was information you didn't have.
But you weren't missing information, you were missing the rule, and the rule is simple. Some employees are not evaluated on whether they do their job well. They're evaluated on whether removing them creates work for someone above them. That's the distinction no one tells you. When you report someone for being late, missing deadlines, creating problems, what you think you're doing is flagging a performance issue. What you're actually doing is asking management to solve a problem. They're being protected because firing them would require effort, documentation, risk, and time from people who have decided that tolerating the problem is easier. Here's what actually happened. Every time you complained, someone in leadership ran a calculation. Not a moral calculation, not a fairness calculation, a workload calculation. If we remove this person, what falls to me? What do I have to personally handle? Who do I have to train? What breaks if the knowledge transfer fails? And if the answer creates more immediate work than keeping the person does, the complaint gets acknowledged, filed, and ignored. You were never asking for accountability. You were asking someone to accept a burden they had no incentive to carry. The manager isn't protecting the employee because they care about them. They're protecting them because that employee currently absorbs responsibilities the manager doesn't want to absorb themselves. The employee might do those responsibilities badly, but they're still doing them. And if they're removed, those responsibilities don't disappear. They land on someone's desk, usually the manager's. That's the actual reason they're untouchable. Not value, convenience.
The reason is this. Reliable employees create expectations. Unreliable employees lower them. And once a manager has adapted to low performance, they often prefer predictable dysfunction over the pressure of maintaining high standards.
Think about what happens when you consistently deliver. You become the baseline. You become what management expects from everyone, which means you've created a standard they now have to enforce with others, or explain why they're not enforcing it.
But the underperformer, they've set the bar so low that anything slightly better feels like improvement. They've trained management to expect less, and expecting less is easier than managing more.
This is why you've seen managers get visibly annoyed with competent employees for small mistakes, while giving endless patience to someone who makes those mistakes constantly. It's not favoritism, it's calibration. The competent employee has created an expectation of competence. The underperformer has created an expectation of problems. And violations of expectation trigger stronger reactions than confirmations of expectation. You're being held to the standard you created. They're being held to the standard they created. And their standard is lower because management allowed it to stay lower.
Here's what this did to you without you realizing it. At some point, you stopped trying to fix the problem. You started working around it. You took on extra tasks to compensate for what they weren't doing.
You stopped including them in critical projects. You developed systems to route around their incompetence. And you thought you were being professional, being a team player, keeping things running smoothly. But what you actually did was make them more disposable and yourself more essential. Which sounds good until you realize what essential means in a company that evaluates cost, not contribution. Essential means you're now the person holding things together, which means if you leave, things fall apart. Which means management has quietly become dependent on you to compensate for the problems they refuse to solve.
You thought you were proving your value. What you actually did was absorb the work that should have forced them to remove the untouchable employee. And now you're doing two jobs while they're doing half of one. And here's the worst part. You're more likely to burn out and leave than they are because they've learned how to survive by lowering expectations. You've learned how to survive by exceeding them. This is the hidden consequence of untouchable employees that no one explains. They don't just survive, they change how management evaluates everyone around them. Once a manager has adapted to tolerating poor performance, their priorities shift. They start valuing predictability over excellence, quietness over initiative, low disruption over high output, because the untouchable employee has trained them to prioritize stability over improvement. And you trying to improve things have become the disruption.
You've probably had moments where you raised a legitimate issue and your manager reacted like you were creating a problem instead of identifying one. Where you suggested a better process and got resistance instead of interest. Where you pushed for accountability and got told to focus on your own work. You thought your manager was incompetent or didn't care, but what actually happened was that you threatened the equilibrium they'd built around the underperformer. You wanted to solve a problem they'd already decided to live with, and solving it would create work they'd successfully avoided by letting you compensate for it instead.
Now apply this to why certain people survive layoffs. It's not because they're better, it's because they've made themselves annoying to remove. They have tribal knowledge no one documented. They have relationships with clients or vendors that feel too risky to transfer. They've been there long enough that replacing them requires more institutional memory than anyone wants to rebuild.
So when restructuring happens, leadership looks at two lists. One list is people whose absence creates immediate workflow continuity issues. The other list is people whose work can be redistributed without operational panic. The competent employee who documented everything, cross-trained their team, and made themselves replaceable, they're on the second list. The dysfunctional employee who hoarded information and became a single point of failure, they're on the first list, and the first list survives. You've been operating in a system that rewards embedding, not excellence, where job security comes from being operationally difficult to extract, not from being good at what you do. The employees who survive aren't the ones who perform the best. They're the ones who would create the most work for management if removed. And once you understand that, every inexplicable decision you've witnessed suddenly makes sense. That manager who kept someone terrible and laid off someone great, they were managing their own workload, not team performance. That HR complaint that went nowhere, it was evaluated against the cost of resolution, not the validity of the claim. That reorganization that seemed to protect all the wrong people. It protected the people who were most embedded in undocumented processes, not the people who were most valuable to document. What looked like dysfunction was actually a coherent system, optimizing for management convenience instead of organizational performance. You've spent years wondering why competence didn't protect you, why hard work didn't matter, why the people who deserved consequences never faced them. And the answer was never about fairness or merit or justice. It was about who created work for the people making decisions and who absorbed it.
The untouchable employee created predictable problems that management learned to ignore. You created solutions that management learned to depend on. And in a system that prioritizes avoiding work over doing it well, the person who created less work for leadership had more protection than the person who did more work for the company.
That coworker you've been watching get away with everything for years isn't untouchable because no one knows they're a problem. Everyone knows. They've always known. They just decided that you solving the problem for free was better than them solving it officially. And every time you compensated, every time you worked around them, every time you kept things running despite them, you gave management permission to do.